Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the AVPN webinar on Funding Sustainable Livelihoods in India, Challenges and Opportunities. My name is Kavita and I'm the Manager, Knowledge Center at the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network, India. AVPN is a unique funders network committed to building a high-impact philanthropy and social investment community across Asia. Currently, we have over 500 members across 29 countries, and we are very pleased to have two of our members based in India speaking today. In the webinar today, we'll be discussing the findings of a study on the funding landscape of sustainable livelihood in India. The study was funded by the Ford Foundation. Representing Catalyst Foundation, we have Siddhi Mankad, who is a trustee. Siddhi will take us through the perspective of the funders and investors and will discuss the challenges and opportunities in this space. Following that, we have Chandrakant Kumaragiri, Country Director, Ennovent India. He will show us the demand-side perspective that includes the fund receivers and will discuss the challenges faced by them and the opportunities available to fund them. Before we proceed, a few housekeeping instructions. We will not take any questions during the presentation, but we will open up the floor for Q&A afterwards. Please feel free to use the console to type in your questions during the webinar, and I will raise the questions to our speakers. If you have further questions that are not answered by the end of the webinar, you can email us at india@avpn.asia. Without further ado, I will now hand over the presentation to Siddhi.
Hello, and good afternoon from us in India here. So today I'm going to be sharing with you the findings of a study by the Catalyst Foundation, which was supported by AVPN. This is on private investments in the social sector in India. So we were 4 authors to this study from the Catalyst group, and I also have 2 of them, Raghunathan and Arunabha, here with me today. So quickly, I'd like to just share about the Catalyst group. So we are a group of 6 organizations. The Catalyst Foundation provides the vision, synergy, and direction to the group. We have been working for over 25 years in the social sector to promote the health and wealth of the poor and marginalized communities. We reach the communities in different ways, either through direct intervention models, solution services to other partners who are invested in social development, and also investment and incubation of innovative ideas for impact. Together, we've operated across multiple themes, including livelihoods, health, education, biodiversity, and so on. So today, I'll be giving a quick overview of this study and then look at the categorization of private investors and funders, their preferences in funding sustainable livelihoods, how they look at outcome, impact, scale, and sustainability, some challenges and struggles, and recommendations. So quickly about the study, we looked at the supply side of the private funding of sustainable livelihoods. So we did not consider funding by the government and bilateral and multilateral agencies. We reviewed secondary data on and information that was available in the public domain. We also met 35 private investors and interviewed them, asking them to share their preferences for investment, their priorities, processes, experiences, and other trends in the sector. So at the end of it, we categorized the investors into 4 types: corporates, private family foundations, impact funds, and intermediaries. So first we look at the corporates. We've described the corporates as CSR, that is short form for corporate social responsibility, and corporate foundations. So in India, the corporates, certain corporates are mandated by law to spend 2% of their average net profit on social causes. So we've labeled these as CSRs. Besides these, there are also some very large corporates that have set up their own foundations through which they invest in the sector. So depending on why and how they invest, we find a strategy spectrum with 3 strategies. So at the one end of the spectrum, we have the geographical strategy. So these are usually the CSRs, the corporates who invest to comply to the legal mandate. They prefer to invest in areas that are close by to their operations. They also have a rather short-term of engagement. Their investments are managed by internal operations or HR teams or individuals. Then there is the thematic strategy, and this is usually the corporate foundations who invest in other NGO initiatives. So often these corporates would support themes or activities related to their area of expertise. For example, tech companies might just fund development of a tech app, or a food company might invest on nutrition outcomes. The institutional strategy is the most intensive strategy of the 3. So this is also a foundation strategy, and it is based on a very long-term vision of impact. These corporate foundations understand the development approach. Often they implement direct programs on the ground themselves or are very closely engaged in programs of the NGOs that they support. And they also fund a wide variety of activities. The next are the private and family foundations. So the funding source in family foundations is from members of the single family, while in the private foundations, it is through private endowments. Family foundations, usually you have one or more family members who are engaged in the governance and management. In private foundations, it is largely for professionals. Family foundations have also been described as understated philanthropy because they prefer to maintain confidentiality in their activities. So information on them, even when we were looking online, we found that there is very rare or limited information on family foundations. Now, both these type of investors are charitable in nature. They extend grants and they do not expect return on their investments. And this is where what sets them apart from the next category, which is the impact funds. Because the impact funds have a stated expectation of financial return on their investments. They also invest through debt, equity instruments, or a mix of the 2. Finally, the 4th category are the intermediaries, who are aggregators, and they collate funds. They pool funds from CSRs, philanthropists, and other donors who do not directly invest themselves. Their investments, therefore, are largely driven by the interests and philosophies of their pool of investors. So we then looked at the private investors and their preferences for investment. So now, when we look at geography, a majority of the investors are not very selective about geography, except, as I was mentioning earlier, the CSRs, where about 60% said that they prefer to invest in geographies that are proximate to their areas of operation. One clear preference in geography was investment in areas with scarce and depleted natural resources. Few investors also indicated their specific preference for exclusively rural or urban focus. When we were looking at the social groups, and given that the whole investment agenda is social in nature, there is a high preference to fund initiatives working with the bottom of pyramid and poor communities. Preference is also high for communities affected by agroclimatic conditions and also for funding entrepreneurs. There is no or very little interest in groups like LGBTQ, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, linguistic minorities. However, the investors did tell us that the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes do get covered very often because they are poor and they do reside in difficult geographies. Majority of the investors are gender agnostic, but around 40% did share that they make investment decisions through a gender lens, and these are largely foundations. When we look at occupational groups, there is little preference for funding special occupational groups, but wherever this preference does exist, it is geared towards agriculture and allied, micro enterprise, artisans, and traditional trades. Also enterprises in the urban informal sector. When we look at livelihood forms, all different kinds of forms get covered. So it includes rural, urban, farm, and non-farm, and urban informal sectors also. However, the focus in all of this is towards enhancing technical skills, and there is less inclination towards funding soft skills. On programs, strategies, and approaches, skilling for employment, capacity building, service delivery, these are some of the preferred areas for investment, as also as integrated services and platforms for collaborative working. There is low interest in funding organizational development and human resource development. However, recently this seems to have garnered a little more interest. However, there is just no appetite for rights-based work. So when we look at these preferences overall, we find that there are some critical issues that can make transformational changes for communities, and they lie low on the preference scale. For instance, support to the ultra poor is low, and these are communities who are very difficult to reach. It takes lots of effort to graduate and keep them out of poverty. Rights-based support is low, and this is a problem because this gives the voice to the vulnerable and oppressed. But usually investors shy away because it can be rather political in nature. And finally, organizational development. This would include funding things like core mission costs, like leadership development, back-end technologies, talent acquisition, etc. These are things which remain elusive. Now, what do private investors say about outcome, impact, scale, and sustainability? So overall, all the investors appreciate the importance of measuring outcomes and impact, and they are behind having M&E systems that support the organizations to measure these. When it comes to impact evaluations, it's only the foundations that invest in very rigorous impact evaluations. Others prefer program evaluations because of the time and cost associated with impact evaluations. On scale and sustainability, the investors view the end game as uptake of the initiatives by government or commercial agencies, because that would continue them to the future. They also understand the need and importance of collaboration to achieve scale and sustainability. Scale, of course, is largely through getting additional funds from either the government or the market. And in terms of sustainability, investors prioritize programs that have a long-term vision and sustainability plans. On the struggles that they face, it's very interesting because the investors are looking to identify high caliber organizations to fund. However, they themselves have a low interest in investing in areas like organizational development and human resource development, which would ultimately make organizations more efficient and effective. Also, they don't want to invest in areas like communication, and that is why some very good initiatives that do not have the capacity for communication, they remain under the radar. So similarly, they also want to find innovative initiatives to fund, but they themselves are a little shy to fund innovations because there is a risk of failure. Collaboration is also a struggle because you have partners with different mandates, and for that to get a shared vision becomes difficult. And yet collaborations are very important to reach scale and sustainability. And finally, they do face difficulties in working in settings with frequent changes in government schemes and priorities. So finally, we looked at some recommendations through the information and insights that we generated through the study. So on the program design, we recommend that private investors consider funding innovations. This includes recognizing competent enterprises and non-profits to promote innovative projects. They should also look at funding inclusion. For example, inclusive supply chains, sustainability initiatives that could revive and augment environmental resources, and also look at diversified livelihoods. On the impact measures, since impact evaluations are cost and effort intensive, Having a comprehensive set of impact measures for sustainable livelihoods would add value to the sector. Finally, we say that they should consider funding more integrated solutions that would provide accelerated impact. On the capacity and capability, we suggest that capacity and organizational development of the NGOs should be supported, including the core mission costs, because this would then also allow more small NGOs to receive funds. We also suggest that investors invest in innovative financial models that would keep fund flow active in the long run and would also then promote sustainability. They should also look at funding innovative mechanisms like pay for results, collateral-free debts, cash flow financing, and structures like warehouse receipts. However, these are not prevalent very widely within the sector, and there's very limited awareness and knowledge around these mechanisms, particularly from the demand side. Finally, there is an opportunity to strengthen partnerships and collaborations. This is possible by building sectoral level digital platforms that can leverage tested solutions, by promoting unusual partnerships that bring different skill sets to the project, and then by coming together of various groups. So you could have foundations, impact investors, intermediaries, etc. Any mix of these coming together, and then they can look together to test and implement certain scalable models. So that's the end with me and my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Siddhi. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're able to hear me. I'm Tamara Conte from Ennovent. I head Ennovent India, and in the study, Ennovent sort of did research on the challenges and opportunities on the demand side, so the implementer side of the sustainable livelihoods. Today, I'm just going to go through a bit about brief about what Ennovent does, a brief, like Siddhi said, about the background of sort of sustainable livelihoods and where we looked at it, how we went about doing the study, and then getting into sort of the findings and the conversations that we've had with the implementers, and finally providing some recommendations sort of that are in line with what even Siddhi said. So getting into, so Ennovent is a venture catalyst, by which we mean we sort of catalyze businesses and business ideas that are looking at unexplored low-income markets in developing countries. We currently primarily looking at environment, wash, and healthcare. So livelihood sort of covers across these three sectors. And over the last decade, we've worked with various kinds of organizations, from private to public to third sector organizations, to help sort of catalyze partnerships that are able to share risks and rewards so that sustainable impact can be achieved. And we do this by supporting sort of businesses and business ideas to access market and sort of establish themselves. So when we started sort of looking at the demand side, what we thought was to sort of encompass the whole sphere, with the sort of the wide-ranging sphere, into a diagram, as all of you can probably see on the right-hand side. We said, because we're looking at the implementers, so we put the implementers at the core, along with the resources that are required to help them achieve and work towards a sustainable livelihood. And through our secondary research, we noticed that there are sort of 5 factors that sort of impact the work that implementers do. At the core being the communities where the impact and sustainable livelihood needs to be created. The 2 kinds of financial actors that Siddhi and her team sort of highlighted earlier, which is both the private side as well as sort of, by private we meant sort of more on the banks, the venture capital, the investments, the angel investors, and also on the grants and sort of philanthropic investments. So financial actors that sort of impact the kind of work the implementers do. Government is a key role, both in terms of ensuring there is optimal policies and regulations so that implementation is happening efficiently, but also in terms of what in all our conversations, the organizations that we interviewed said was that the governments can help scale the programs that they're doing. And the other sort of key aspect that we found integral, especially going forward, is markets. By markets, we mean sort of access for local sort of entrepreneurs or organizations to access information, to access sort of goods and services so that they can scale. So as a whole, the interactions between the different sort of outlying players as well as the implementers is what drives, we noticed, the generation of a sustainable livelihood. In going about doing this, we sort of split the study into two halves, the first being more on the literature review and the secondary research. But we also, as our secondary research, interviewed 6 sort of really experienced individuals that have been working for multiple decades within the livelihood space to come up with sort of perspectives on seeing if it, what kind can we expect when we are sort of going and talking to the end implementers. And we came up with certain hypotheses, which then we sort of looked at validating through our primary research. In the primary research, we were able to talk to around 44 organizations that are spread across sectors, as you can see, from the agri to the rural tourism. So it's quite a wide range of organizations, and also to try and see, our goal was to have conversations with organizations that are working in Tier 3, Tier 4 cities to get a different perspective from those that are working in sort of the metro cities. And most of these organizations work in different forms, which I'll try and touch base on over the course of my presentation. They access funding in different mechanisms, like Siddhi mentioned, from grants, investments, loans, credits, and also sort of entrepreneurial activities. So some of the insights, what we noticed is, though agriculture happens to be still a major component of the sustainable livelihood space in India, it is the other sort of non-agri activities are also increasing, is what the organizations that we spoke to highlighted. Even though that is increasing, productivity levels in the agri space, as well as sort of poor market linkages, which leads to farmers or agri entrepreneurs unable to realize the price that they would like or deserve. So that is one of the key challenges that organizations that are working within the space have highlighted. Though other forms of sort of livelihood activities are increasing in the rural economy, one of the critical non-agri activity that organizations highlighted was artisans and craftspeople. But one of the challenges with that sector is the lack of support in trying to get them to scale. There are instances here across the country where artisans have been able to scale, access global, even not even national, but also global markets. But because it's such an unorganized sector, the level of sort of access is quite fragmented. And that can lead to challenges in certain instances, in certain geographies, is what the organizations were highlighting. The other thing that has been said multiple times is a lack of skilled labor. So, there are lots of activities that the government is pushing, but also other organizations that are looking to help bridge the massive skill gap, which is a requirement, as past study is about 127 million in the next 5 to 10 years. There is still massive challenges when it comes to providing adequate training, either in terms of infrastructure or because the curricula that the training is used is not up to date, or also this training that is given isn't standardized across the country, which means a skilling activity that is provided, say, in the north of the country would probably be very different to in other parts. So that is another gap and challenge that organizations are facing to help sort of streamline the whole skilling activity. Of late, over the last couple of years, there has been a massive drive towards the adoption of entrepreneurship as a livelihood activity. And even then, what organizations, and from our research, what we found is entrepreneurship is still at a micro entrepreneur, at an individual level, and not yet still at a point where it generates employment for other sort of members of the community. And also in terms of adoption of innovation. By innovation, organizations said it's not just in terms of adopting innovative technologies, innovative sort of products, but also innovation in terms of the way they access funding. Most organizations that were not-for-profits that we spoke to are looking and exploring at innovative ways of raising money for working capital to try and ensure that they are sustainable and survive for a longer duration than being consistently supported by grants. One of the issues that the organizations are facing is that was highlighted, that impact takes time and impact requires patient capital support. So the request from the organization is to have that in mind when funding activities. And like Siddhi mentioned, the CSR sort of or corporates that the organizations that we spoke to interacted with found CSR to be very restrictive, either because the corporate would like to work within the geography where they function, either because of regulation or because of the interest. So, and not where probably the organization would like to implement. So there is sort of a gap between what probably the implementer wants and what CSR can provide at this stage. Another gap that organizations noticed that is still missing is funding support that allows for social enterprises or organizations that have products and services to have that market link. I know there's one project that is doing in the Northeast that has, through the support of Amazon, provided market linkages for the artisans in the Northeast. And there would be further support that maybe corporates and other private sector organizations can give and fund these market linkages activities to ensure a much more sustainable sort of livelihood impact. Social enterprises, like other organizations and like the impact that we would like to see, also need a lot of sort of patient capital to not just build their own organizations, but also to able to generate in returns on investment for the sort of the social investors, the impact funds that that are funding them. The other thing, I guess, resonating what Siddhi said is the ecosystem development. All organizations that we spoke to were very firm in letting us know that there is a need for collaboration and partnerships, and to the point where maybe implementing organizations are able to work together to approach funding, because until now, implementing organizations have seen funding windows as a very competitive exercise where they are competing against the other implementers to access a small pool of funding. But the mere act of partnerships can lead to maybe amplified impact. And they are encouraging funders to support partnership forming and ecosystem development to ensure that there is a higher chance of sustainable sort of impact. The other sort of finding that, as I had mentioned previously, is the rise and the adoption of entrepreneurship. And as I had mentioned earlier, also the adoption of innovation. Innovation is not just adoption of innovative activities in terms of products and services, but also more than a couple of instances in the organizations that we spoke to were looking at market-based models to generate working capital and sort of survival funds to ensure that they are much more sustainable in the longer run because of the instability or the time taken in terms of philanthropic support. And as I had mentioned, during our study, what we noticed that entrepreneurship, maybe at a grassroots level, is still at a micro entrepreneurship level and not still evolved on a wide-ranging area into becoming an employment generation. If there is support provided along those lines, then the social entrepreneurs that we spoke to would like to move towards that. Skilling, as I had mentioned, there's a gap around infrastructure in terms of content and delivery. And that also needs to be looked at to see how these gaps can be constructively addressed. And like all investors, what the organizations felt was donors and investors tend to be risk averse. That's probably why maybe they've pooled around certain geographies or certain sort of types of investment and not spread out and cover the wide spectrum of sustainable livelihoods. Some of the other support sort of constraints and opportunities that the organizations feel they would like, I think is, this is again sort of resonating what Siddhi said, organizations feel they would like funding support to grow themselves, to strengthen their own institutions, because they feel that once those institutions are stronger, they can provide much more efficient and effective sort of sustainable impact and generate sustainable livelihoods. So, the other thing is, as I had mentioned, geography. Organizations have felt that funders tend to focus and cluster around certain geographies and not on areas either when it comes to LGBTQ or sort of geographical support, marginalized communities. So they are seeking support and funding support along those lines. The other key area that an opportunity constraint is if there are all the implementing organizations felt that a clear line of communication between donors and donee leads to much more constructive sharing of learnings and also strengthen the effectiveness with which the implementers can implement and move towards more sustainable livelihoods. So those are some of the findings, and based on that, we sort of have sort of summarized them into around 5 recommendations that would reiterate what I've been talking about over the last couple of minutes is organizations felt that up till this point they've been working in silos, so there is a need for increased communication and collaboration and sort of cultivating partnerships. It has happened far and few between from what we heard from experienced organizations that have been in the sector for the last 3 or 4 decades, but more of that is required. And if funders can also encourage that, then it would lead to a much more strengthened space. And the other aspect is around market linkages. There has been an immense rise in the adoption of entrepreneurship and in the space. So to be able for entrepreneurship to be effective also is to ensure that there is good sort of strengthened value chains and provide market linkages, either when it comes to the agri space, the producers, or the artisans for a marketplace that is at a national level or at a global level, to ensure that it survives beyond a so-called project period. Finally, it would be there have been over the last couple of years an increased amount of impact investors and investors that are coming in to support entrepreneurship. If these investors are able to be a lot more patient, because social entrepreneurship and sort of impact focused for-profit enterprises take time to become much more sustainable as a business, but also generate sort of the impact and the returns that investors are seeking. It'll also promote sort of self-sufficient local ownership and much more effective sort of institutions that can probably survive longer. The organizations, the social enterprises, as well as the not-for-profits that are looking at the hybrid models, are seeking training in terms of the entrepreneurship, in creating sort of government institutions that allow and promote an ecosystem that supports impact entrepreneurship is what they are seeking. And finally, the sort of support that organizations are seeking is one on institutional development, because as I think once again Siddhi mentioned, is there even the funders are looking and are interested at good merit-based organizations, and to be able to have more of those to create a much more sustainable livelihood, funders would need to look at creating institutions that are promoting institutional training and institutional sort of development, and also looking at funders that are sort of geographies that are a lot more wide-ranging, and looking at non-metro cities, Tier 4, Tier 5 cities, to ensure that it's a much more inclusive, sustainable livelihood. Yeah, so with that, I would like to thank you for your time. Over to you, Kavita.
Thank you, Chandrakant. So now we'll be taking the questions from the audience, and the audience is requested to type in the questions through the console, and I'll raise it to Siddhi and Chandrakant, whichever questions are related to them. So let me just take the first question. The first question is for you, Siddhi. Any Indian foundations on your radar that are focusing on climate change, diversity and inclusion, including gender equality? This is a question from Michelle.
This colleague was there online. There is, for example, Nilikani Philanthropies is focusing on climate change and conservation and work around diversity inclusion over there. So that's one of the foundations that is doing that.
Chandrakant, this is a question for you, which says they would love to hear more interesting ventures or projects that Ennovent has invested in.
Okay. Because we are an impact investor as well, we have 5 organizations across healthcare, waste management, skill development, and primary education. And the waste management company is based out of Bangalore and is working in Karnataka. They're called Hasirudala. They are also generating a lot of livelihood among the sort of informal workforce that, if I'm not mistaken, they currently employ over 100 informal waste pickers around Karnataka to support them. The other organization is a healthcare company in the Northeast in Assam that is providing low cost, high quality eye care across 4 hospitals in sort of rural Assam, and they also try and employ local sort of communities, and so it's not just it's for the community, by the community. Most of the people, over 100 people that the company employs, are SMEs and within the region, from the region. They're ERC eye care. So yeah, and there are quite a few other names I'm happy to share after the call as well.
Sure. And Siddhi, this is a question for you. Why do investors shy away from right-based investment and are less inclined towards investing in soft skills? Aren't they very critical from the development perspective? This is a question from Maya.
Sure. I'll just take that, but before that, just on the previous question, there's also Azim Premji Foundation. Azim Premji, philanthropic initiatives, AVPI, that also invests in environment and climate change. On this particular question, so the whole area of rights-based is really very important, certainly because, as I said, it gives a voice to the voiceless. But what happens is very political in nature, and then when you're trying to work across with different kinds of partners like the government and all, you don't want to really get into having a very strong stand for or against something. So these are the kind of things which could become a problem down the line. Soft skills, again, they're more difficult to work with. So technical skills, there's a lot of things already available in the sector, as well as it's easier to just teach technical skills. It's also easier to measure the outcomes and all for that. So soft skills, because it becomes more difficult. So I think the requirement here is also that there needs to be some kind of see, a lot of these donors from the supply side are really new to investing in the development sector. What also happens is that they bring in a lot of their experiences from the corporate sector and they come in and invest. Now, while this is extremely useful because there's a lot to learn from the other sector, sometimes it's also important for them to really inundate themselves within the sector and really understand the uniqueness, the difference that the sector is there and it offers. So like I think Chandrakant was also earlier talking about, patience. There is no patience, and they need to understand that there is patience. Things will not happen as quickly as possible. Also, how to look at talking the language of the development sector. So these are some of the issues that come up, and that is why if this bridge can be crossed, then a lot of these other areas that are not getting adequate funding, they can get sourced. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think all the organizations that we spoke to were also highlighting the fact that if there are clearer lines of communication between the implementers and the funders, then maybe the funders are also able to get better acquainted with the language and the ground reality before maybe they fund. And might also, so the clearer line of communications is one of the key things that all our organizations that we spoke to have highlighted because of the factors that Siddhi, you mentioned, I think.
Yeah. So, Chandrakant, this is a question for you from Brajesh. He says one of the challenges for implementing agencies is that donor support is short term. And what's your view on that?
Very much. The not-for-profits that we spoke to, every single organization highlighted that, and that's why most of those organizations are now looking at market-based solutions because of the fact that philanthropic support or donor support is so short-term or time-based. So if they're able to figure out innovative sort of funding mechanisms that will allow them to continue to do the work that they're doing and at the same time survive. So that's one of the reasons why not-for-profits are looking at hybrid models to set up sort of and bridge this funding challenge. So, and they are seeking support because I know of organizations in the Western sort of part of the country that are looking at a certain group of not-for-profits that want to look at models where they can create these market-based models for precisely the factor that you mentioned. And they're also looking at diversifying the way they get funding so that they're able to ensure that they're there longer term, and it's not like they're moving from one project the moment everything, the funding stops, the project stops, which has happened over the last couple of decades, which I think Catalyst team can also highlight. It has happened more than once. So, yeah.
So, Siddhi, there's a question for you. Can you throw some light on what you mean by fund innovation in program design?
Sure. So basically, what we're saying there is, so we're looking at recognizing certain enterprises and not-for-profits who can then promote innovative projects. So when we're looking at the program design, what happens here is, as I said earlier, that it is difficult to get innovations already there on the ground. It is difficult to identify them, and they might be there, but many of them are not identified because they're not either large scale or they're not something where they're communicated well. So one of the things is to first look at trying to identify different innovations. The other thing is also then to look at also seeing which are some of the enterprises or non-profits where there is a possibility to also get some different kinds of solutions out. And it would be this kind of funding that we're looking at within the program design.
Chandrakant, there's a question for you from Anant, and he says,
Okay.
How do we form the collaborations that you're talking about? I have a non-profit in agri-tech from Maharashtra. Is there an organization collaboration that is seeking matching portal?
So there are two ways, I think. One is we try and, because we support organizations across the board, we try and make those linkages and those introductions. So impact investors that have been around for a while, that are working in different sort of spheres, I know them that they would be more than willing to support. And I also know we're trying to create a platform based on sector focus, so that organizations like yourself can maybe sort of get showcased and then collaborate. So our aim as a catalyst of businesses and business ventures is to help bridge those collaborations. So if you are willing to introduce, I can introduce and have a conversation with Anant and see how we can sort of help create or help them move towards path of collaboration. So there is a requirement for more one is open communication. If you're able to have conversations with people who have that network, and impact investors or investors we have and we speak. So that's one. And then there are platforms and programs that allow for such collaboration, I would say. I hope that answers.
Siddhi, would you like to say how Catalyst can help in this?
Could I just get back to you on that?
Okay, sure. So we will now have to stop the Q&As with the audience because we are running short of time now. So I thank all of you for the participation in this interesting session, and thank you Siddhi and Chandrakant. We will post the webinar recording on our website by next week, so please look out for it. Also, the AVPN conference will be held from 25th to 28th June in Singapore, and the conference will bring together a diverse group of funders and resource providers from around Asia on one platform for multi-sectoral collaboration and knowledge sharing. The early bird registrations for the conference will end on the 31st March, so please visit the conference website and get registered. And thank you all of you and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Kavita. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.